So Michael Picard was born in Ottawa, raised in Alberta. He completed a BA with honors in philosophy at the University of Calgary, went on to earn an MSc and a PhD in philosophy at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Besides philosophy, he's taught mathematics, psychology, cognitive science, leadership, and sustainability in various capacities in the US and Canada. He currently writes and teaches philosophy at Douglas College in Vancouver, Canada. Dr. Picard has animated over 700 sessions of public participatory philosophy. I will add that that usually means philosophy cafes, but not always. He's founder of Cafe Philosophy, a 12-year series of weekly philosophical dialogues for the general public in Victoria, Canada. And he's been a longtime facilitator with Simon Fraser University's Philosophers Cafe program. For several years, he also ran Salon Philosophy, public reading groups in Eastern and Western philosophy. Emerging from this experience, Picard has recently played curator, editor, and contributor to our main topic today, Cafe Conversations, Philosophical Dialogue in Public Spaces, an anthology of writings by cafe philosophy facilitators, theorists, and commentators from all over the world, including fresh translations from the French of Marc Saudet, who created cafe philosophy in Paris in the early 1990s. This collection, the first on the subject in English, is out this year with Rocks Mills Press in Canada. And again, that's the main topic of our discussion today. Picard has a couple of other books that we'll bring up, I'm sure. One of them I have handy, I'll show you in a moment. Picard's critical reflections on public participatory philosophy have also led him to develop an app, in effect a virtual infrastructure for philosophical dialogue and civil discourse. We could sure use something like that at this time. It's called Tug of Logic. This freely available web app enables a social reasoning game that assembled participants play in part on their phones or on other internet-connected devices. It's a game of facilitated reasoning that encourages collaborative, competitive construction of logical arguments. The game has been featured since 2019 at the 2019 Canadian High School Ethics Bowl at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I'll just say one little thing about the game. It encourages, the winner is someone who's changed their mind rather than someone who hasn't. That's a great thing. I love to hear how you do that, Michael. Picard is author of the widely translated This Is Not a Book, now in print as Philosophy, Adventures in Thought and Reasoning, which has a global circulation of over 150,000. And he's co-author of the similarly successful Paradoxes, From Illusions to Infinity, Adventures in the Impossible. He's authorized translator of 2 books, Philosophical Praxis, for which I wrote a blurb, here's that book, a translation from Gerd Achenbach, one of the founders of philosophical counseling, and On Right in Wrong, which is forthcoming, both with Lexington Books, written by the German philosopher Gerd Achenbach, widely recognized as the founder of philosophical counseling. Ex-president of the former Canadian Society for Philosophical Practice, Michael Picard is a certified counselor of the American Philosophical Practice Association, that's APPA, and has received training in philosophical practice from Gerd Achenbach. He lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and offers philosophical counseling via his website, www.philosophical-coaching.com. All right, so without further ado, welcome, Professor Picard. It's great to finally meet you with attention on you. I think we've been in similar audiences occasionally, but I don't think we've really spoken much to each other. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right, so I just told everybody a little bit about you, but let's go a little further and have you tell us about yourselves. These are the same questions that I generally will be asked our last guest, which was Alexander Sasha Fatic, and I'll be asking similar questions to our future ones. This way everybody kind of gets the same shake here. So how did you get into philosophy, Michael?
Oh, that's didn't expect that, but it's a surprisingly timely question. Actually, when I was I think a grade 11 student in a small rural school or a school in a small town in Alberta, I had a friend who was going off to university the next day, and we were walking around talking about whether the universe was subjective or objective. That was the language that we were using. And he said, we couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure it out. So he decided, he said, can't wait till I go to university next year. And I was so struck by this pun that I decided the universe and university that I thought, well, I'm going to university. That was it. So it was really to look at philosophical questions. At the time, I think what provoked the discussion was I was reading Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Um, and to my incredible surprise, the first week-long workshop I did with Gerd Achenbach this summer in the Italian Alps, I wasn't quite prepared for it. I just showed up, but I found out that the topic for the whole week was Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So the thing that started me off was what I've been most recently thinking about. So surprisingly, that's how I started. And then I went to university. I took a wide variety of things, but I did best in philosophy, and I was afraid of bad grades, so I just sort of stuck to philosophy.
Yeah, interesting. I'm sure you're not the only one who, or for whom, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was one of the first philosophical books that they read. That was one of mine for sure. Although I
My
certainly did not understand it at the time when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I reread it over the summer, and I realized how little I understood it. In fact, I tried to reread it in graduate school, and he gets some things wrong about Kant and Poincaré, who I was writing on at the time, so I couldn't reread it in graduate school. It was not precise enough, but for what I was being trained in at MIT. But actually, my history in philosophy goes back. That probably is the first book in philosophy that I read through. But my earliest philosophical memory is a kind of a William James themed one. Of course, I didn't realize that till much later. But um, it's I was sitting on this chair, which we called the daddy chair, and the arm of the chair was a little bit ripped open. There was some stuffing, and my older siblings had tried to play a joke on us by taking white bread, the center of it rolling up, kids just like the center of it, popping it in their mouth and saying, "I'm eating stuffing from the daddy chair." So I was sitting there all alone in this chair one day, and I had a piece of white bread, and I rolled up the center of it, and I said, "I'm eating stuffing from the daddy chair," and I popped it into my mouth, and to my great surprise, it was bread. And suddenly I had this sort of moment of awareness. I managed to pull a joke on myself, in other words, and I had this realization which was I am me, which was this like subjective and objective versions of self equating and becoming identified. It was like a discovery. Uh, so and there's a few other things quite early on that I have the experiences like that I've since been able to interpret in philosophical language or terminology. But so pretty dyed in the wool in my case.
Yeah, coincidentally, I reread the Persig book last year also because I have a friend who, it turns out, was a huge fan of Persig and persuaded me to reread it. And it was okay. It didn't do much for me, but
I was surprised at the esteem at which Achenbach held the book. I was really quite surprised at it. And he had a way of finding passages and talking about them that was really quite incredible. So uh,
yeah, there were
uh,
some nuggets in there. But I remember thinking overall, there was no like big picture takeaway that I got from the book, which is what I expected. Oh well.
Yeah, I think he kind of plays a little bit fast and loose with the equation of the various mystical approaches, the Tao and Zen and Hinduism, and it's all kind of thrown in there, and it's all also in some other philosophers. It's kind of so it's a little bit loosey goosey, but Achenbach was looking at it large instead as a kind of an expression of the times, an expression of the culture of the
Yeah.
time. Right, and so it didn't get into the actual treatment of the philosophy too much, or the mystical sort of core of it.
Yeah, I think the title and the general narrative was definitely something, just a cultural moment, that
Mhm.
wave carried that book. Half of it was just the title alone. Anything with the word Zen and the art of blank in it, would fit
Yeah,
right in.
apparently he came up with a title pretty early on too in the whole project. It was written to the title. Mm.
All right. So thank you, Michael. Similar, but more specifically, this question: how did you get into philosophical counseling?
Yes, now that is a little bit harder of a story and not so clear of a story. I had heard about it when I was a graduate student at MIT, and I can't quite remember how. I think it was a New York Times article, um, and but and now that I think about it, I might have heard of it or even earlier because one of my undergraduate teachers was Petra von Morstein, who knew Achenbach, was known to Achenbach, and was an early kind of. She was at that first conference on philosophical practice, which took place in Vancouver here,
Yeah.
and had her own practice. So, but it was really only once I'd started cafe philosophy and I was more or less out of work, at least in philosophy, and I opened up a practice in that context.
Okay,
Uh,
so let me interrupt because my next question would have been, how did you get into cafe philosophy? I guess in your case, that question comes first because that led to you getting into philosophical counseling. So tell us how this cafe philosophy thing captured you at first.
anyway,
What led you
sure,
there? How'd you find it?
I will. I'll tell the story a little bit in How to Play Philosophy, which is a collection of essays that I wrote for cafe philosophy in advance of cafe philosophy sessions for the participants. Um, I had heard about it, and I'd lost my job, 1 year job in philosophy at the University of Victoria. And my first reaction was, well, then I'll do it in the cafes. But I didn't do it. I didn't do anything about that. I was completely ineffective and inactive on the topic. But my regular cafe put the idea forward. They pointed out on their bulletin board a London Telegraph article. They were English, I think, these people who um, about Mark Sauté and his. So this was in '96, I guess it must have been. And so I read that article and I stormed out of there. I was furious. And I had a philosophy shop already at the time, so which did come first. We'll have to ask. And I got there and I thought, why am I angry? What did I get angry for here? And the more I thought about it, I realized because I knew I was going to do it, and there was not a single soul to help me with it. Nobody was going to tell me how. It hadn't been done before. I didn't know how to do it. I just had to make it up. So I did, and slowly, it went on for some time, and had quite a trajectory. It was quite vibrant for some years. 7, 8, and 9, I think, are among the best. And then it sort of teetered towards boring and irrelevant. And so that's where the problems arose. Fortunately, I found a real employment at Douglas College, and so I changed cities, and I've been working here since. That's 15 years ago, I think, last month.
So you're not running any cafes anymore? Or you
No,
are?
my plan is to take philosophy sports into the cafes and the Tug of Logic. That's what it was designed for. but it's going to take a little bit of a launch, and um, uh, ideally, I'd like to rework the app one more time. So it's but yeah.
Yeah, you've got a chapter on that in Cafe Conversations. I remember reading that about the tug of logic in there and all of that. But maybe tell us about that. Tell us about the app. And there's a board game version of it. Did you ever come out with that?
Oh, well, the board game version exists, but it's essentially outmoded by the app. The board
Yeah,
game was really a proof of concept. Someone who develops apps advised me, just bring it up to in concept,
proof of
a no
concept.
tech version somehow. Um, so at this point, I had adapted a program or a classroom exercise where you take a controversial issue, have students stand up in a free classroom and take take sides on a controversial issue. So by actually taking sides in the classroom, stepping to one side or the other, and then people have an opportunity to put forward reasons, and others show their agreement with the reasons by moving either towards the front of the class or the back of the class. And so I was thinking about that, and it was really a wonderful moment when the classroom floor shrunk to the size of a board game. And I thought, aha, I can do it that way. I just have people moving their pieces along the board. So I think I have a copy of the game around here, but it's maybe not easy to get. And so people would move. I got these little non-toxic animals as game pieces, and people would move their pieces around. But so the app comes out of that. There's a very similar thing. It starts with a controversial issue, and it needs to be controversial in relationship to the people who are playing the game. So it has to divide the opinion in the room more or less evenly. You don't really want to stack the deck against some people, although some people are willing to take up that heroic one against many challenge. But still, um, there's a straw poll at the beginning of the game to see if people disagree on the controversial proposed main claim, and if they do, then a game can be played, and it's played by individual players entering on their phones. They vote on their phones, but they also enter on their phones individual reasons. They can put more than one, which are then selected for discussion. So the game is really facilitated discussion. It is a form of cafe philosophy, but the facilitator, which I call a logic referee, uh, um, chooses which of the propositions to choose or to discuss, and enters it into discussion. A discussion I call a bout of logical scrimmage. So that's people argue on that. Now, what's distinctive about it is that the actual wording can be changed by the proponent or by the logic referee at any time. So just like in regular conversation, if you misspeak or if someone points something out that's what you were a hidden assumption or something, you might need to bring that to and express that. So that can be updated, and then the voting is updated. So people in the discussion also, besides partaking in the discussion, also vote on this particular reason, whether it's established or contested, is the terminology. So if it's contested, then the logic facilitator can say, so you're contesting it. Why do you contest it? What's wrong with this statement? It sounds pretty reasonable. And if they support to establish it, or some, and you can ask questions like what wording changes would get your vote if you're not accepting it, and things like that. And that goes on for a while, and sometimes the vote can change quite dramatically, and sometimes it sort of stops changing, and people's vote opinions are more or less settled. I actually tried to choose the least controversial premises, sort of one on both sides, for and against, to get things kind of up and running. There's a kind of a leaderboard, as it were, where a common ground that's bifurcated, and if reasons get enough support, terms of voting support, they can be elevated to this common ground. And then there you can work on missing premises, on converging arguments towards the same conclusion. So it works as a kind of logic exercise and brings in a little bit of logical sophistication to the discussion. So if a fact premise is missing is given, a missing value premise might be sought, and so on. So it has an initial, it gives people initial reason to reflect on their positions and to think what they really think a little bit. So it's still fairly superficial in the sense that certainly it's not really a consensus building device. That's the appearance of it, but it really often reveals dissensus, which can be more valuable at times. And the game ends with a final poll on the main claim. And it's there where you determine whether the intervening discussions have the bouts of logical scrimmage have changed anybody's mind. And all that you win, if you have changed your mind, is the last word, a chance to explain why it is that what changed your mind, what reason, what argument, what wording. And that's basically how it works.
I love the title. Like, it's a play on tug of war, but a
Right.
tug of logic. Very brilliant. And I love the idea, which you didn't just mention now, but I mentioned earlier, so maybe you didn't, but I read it in the book, how the winner, if at all, is someone who's actually changed their mind. I guess because
Right.
they're showing that they're philosophically sensitive to the truth and to logic, right? So,
Right.
as opposed to the dogmatist.
Right. So that's determined by the difference. The software sort of automatically reveals the difference between the initial straw poll and the final poll
Right.
on the main claim.
Yeah, you were capable of being persuaded by reason and evidence, which is a good
Right.
thing.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
wondering,
Yeah.
excuse me?
Yeah, it comes out of a critique I heard. I can't remember the philosopher's name, who I think is a YouTube video I saw where someone pointed to as a critique of the traditional adversarial debate, where in effect the winner, goes home with the same position that they had when they came, and only the loser has like an opportunity to learn,
Yeah.
if and whether that's going to happen after this humiliation or not is is a real thing. So it's a modified form of debate that does this trick, which solves the problem of cafe philosophy, or a main problem with cafe problem. A main problem of cafe philosophy is what I call the pedestal problem. Everybody gets up on the pedestal once a week and gets the microphone and gets to say, I think so and so, and then they hand the microphone. And sometimes they don't even say what they think. As I heard this, a controversial thing I heard that seems to be relevant, I'll just throw that in. So they don't even take positions really, and they don't state their positions. But the hospitality of the event encourage them to say whatever they want without critique or without being fear of being sort of criticized. Whereas in the game, because your reasons that you put forward need to get the votes of other people, the notion of truth is sort of socialized in a certain sense. It's the opinion of other people. And so your people are open to rewording their reasons in order to get those votes. And that's really where the tug part comes in, where you're trying to draw people over to your reasons, but you only win when you get when you get pulled over. Yeah. Okay. So that's it.
Yeah, you mentioned just now at the beginning of this last segment that it solves one of the problems of cafe philosophy. So I'm wondering, okay, if you actually had the board game version of it, you could actually use that in the cafe in person, but you could probably play the game on Zoom with people as long as everybody understood the rules rather than on an app, right? I'm
Yes.
imagining a Zoom cafe that actually just played Tug of Logic. It would be a philosophy cafe with a very nice structure that guaranteed that you didn't have this problem that you were just talking about, like everybody's got the pedestal.
Yeah. In principle, you're right. You could play it by Zoom, over Zoom. You could play it. It's a distributed cafe philosophy. Now, you'd want to share the Tug of Logic website screen, like because Zoom, you can't revise premises or vote in the same kind of way,
Yeah.
but still you could do it that way. Now the I've re that's bound to happen, and I would jump at the chance to do it sometime. However, it's conceived as virtual infrastructure for civil discourse. So the idea of being present in the room, and I use it in classrooms in the same way, as an enhancement to the face-to-face encounter. That's what it's for, and so that's what I kind of want to
Yeah.
mostly use it for. Um, but I'm open to trying it. It's obviously it would fit right in. I mean, it wouldn't be difficult to implement, I don't think, on a in a Zoom call. We should do it right now.
Well, maybe next time you come back, you've got a few books here, each of which, and the game itself is worthy of a whole episode here. But today we're talking about this cafe conversations book, which has a whole bunch of other really great essays in it. So I guess we can stick with that for today. So let's talk a little bit about the book. Why did you write that book?
So you're talking the cafe conversations.
Yeah. Oh, and
Yeah.
Michael, I noticed that when I was preparing for this, I accidentally I went to get a picture of the book for the website or whatever, and I grabbed an earlier version of the book off of Amazon with a different subtitle. So is there an interesting history you want to share with us, or just pass on that for now?
Wisdom suggests I should pass, but I'll give you a
Okay.
little. I'll give you a little bit of a snippet. The book was ready a couple of years ago, and it was already a years in the making, just to get all the ducks in a row, because there are a dozen different authors from different countries, and the original contributions were in different languages and so on. The book itself originally came out of a particular it was the brainchild of a local publishing company here, which I won't mention here, being recorded. And so they knew of one of the main contributors, and they wanted a celebratory book. A guy who started the Philosopher's Cafe program at SFU here, and who is a contributor to the book. So I was invited in as the editor to that project. And that's what took so long to get together. It finally got together. I submitted the whole manuscript, and the publisher was not interested at all. It was a little bit longer, and their main object, they were a small, sort of radical street publisher. They do poetry and literature and stuff, and they didn't like my 150 footnotes in the opening chapter at all. So they just dropped us. They had a contract. They broke the contract, and they just dropped it. But anyway, it was all fine. It put us in a little bit of a search, and Rocks Mills in Ontario has picked it up, and they've just been terrific to work with. So the book's going to be coming out within a month or so. I thought it was this month, but it looks like we're getting late in the month. So I think
Yeah.
this fall, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I both thought the book would be out by the time we had this conversation today, so we could show people the book, but that's
Right.
okay. It'll
And
be there.
indeed, about showing the book, you have that cover, but you also found a Rocks Mills cover. Now that is also a temporary cover that he just threw up there, and I don't like it one bit. It looks like a romance novel or something. But anyway, we'll find a good. We're working on a better cover too for it.
When we get the better cover, I'll have Lou put that up on the website.
That would be better, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. I read the whole thing recently, just to prepare for today, and a lot of really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of practical stuff in there about all the like pragmatic and logistical difficulties of getting a cafe off the ground and how to manage, people with the mic and all these different things. There was a really interesting essay about Mark Sore. I said his name wrong. I never had heard it pronounced until I heard you say it. I have one of
Okay,
these.
like French cooking.
Yeah, I have an audio book. Well, what is it? Speechify, and I was listening to the PDF of your book, and this robot was calling it "sort it, sort it, sort it."
Oh
So I had that in my
yeah.
head. Yeah, it's funny, but yeah, it was a fascinating history about him. All sorts of different, really from the practical, pragmatic stuff all the way to the theoretical stuff about the value of this kind of activity and like participatory democracy and all of that. Was there like a favorite essay of yours in there? Or, I mean, you wrote a couple of them yourself.
Yeah, well, we've already sort of spoken about my contributions with the Tug of Logic. I did also write a, excuse me, a long I did also write a long history of the cafe event in Victoria, Canada that I ran.
Yeah.
But there are such histories of other events, like Joseph Wask has a long history of the very large SFU program. Um, uh, Carmen Zavala has a wonderful account of the 20 odd years that they've been going. And I think they have the record now because they're still going on, whereas the SFU program has since ceased to be. And the Peruvians have the record, I think, for sure. And Japan, the movement in Japan is shocking. That it's they had a very early translation of Mark Sauté, and they started quite early, but then after the 2011 disaster, Fukushima disaster, there was all this criticism of government, and they sprang up everywhere. So, and the universities are involved in creating them and managing them. Also, throughout Latin America, there's just Spanish-speaking America is the idea of sitting around with your fellow citizens and philosophizing just makes a lot more sense than it sometimes does in a settler outpost like Vancouver that I live in. But uh, so we have you said it well, a wide range of papers from mostly facilitators from a lot of different countries. I've left out a few in Europe, and then more theoretical papers by people who are involved in especially like philosophy for children. I sort of mind the expertise and the more developed. I consider it kind of parallel problems. How do you philosophize with children? They don't know any philosophy. They never heard of Socrates or Plato or something. How do you philosophize with the general public? They don't know any Plato. It's the same kind of issue in a way. But the solutions can't be the same because the audience are different. But I used some of them to bring in the theory that's related to philosophy for children into the more public kind of discussion. So in this way, Habermas and John Dewey, Hannah Arendt, and many others get drawn into the discussions, Foucault and others. And so that gives it a kind of heady conclusion to the book. But in keeping with the fact that it's not entirely academic philosophy that's taking place, or I should just leave out the word entirely. It's not academic philosophy that's taking place in cafe philosophy. It seemed appropriate that there should be some essays that are also of a more colorful character, let's say. So the final essay, more of a poetic evocation of
Yeah, it was very poetic,
yeah,
very talented poetic writing. It
yeah.
was moving, the imagery and the ability to stir emotion and everything. I was pretty impressed with that. I didn't expect that as the final essay, but
Where else
I
was I
was
going to
like,
put it? That had to
it
be
was
right.
like, no, it was like icing on the cake or something. Yeah, it was nice.
That's very good. That is Joseph Wask, the author there that I just want to mention. He is the spirit that the whole book kind of was going to be devoted to. He's the one who began and ran the Philosopher's Cafe program at Simon Fraser University here, and he's a major patron of the book. The book will also include, you didn't see this, I don't think, the book will also include a bunch of, or at least a limited edition of the book, will include a number of color photographs, including special comics that are called Philosopher's Cafe that were in some cases published but created for the event, and some alchemical drawings to go with the references and the final things. And there's a few photographs as well about the street philosophy in Chile that one of the contributors visited and was invited to. So that's the whole thing will be a little bit more than just a regular academic book, hopefully.
Yeah, I have a colleague, what's his name, Joe Terry, at my college, who was invited by a filmmaker who works in the New York Public Library to do a thing that he calls street philosophy on his philosophy TV channel. And this guy just follows with a camera around Joseph Terry in Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, which is the heart of New York City. And they just stop people and ask them philosophical questions on the street. And I thought, well, that's pretty wild. That's even wilder than the Philosophy Cafe. So, because you never know what. And there was this one shirtless guy who seemed like he might have been homeless, who had like all kind of bizarro claims, conspiratorial and everything. It's interesting to watch a couple of those episodes. But I'm wondering, I never really had a fully public one. I've done a couple of Philosophy Cafes, but they were like, by invitation and whatnot. But, I read about a lot of the people talking about in your book, in the different authors, where, certainly saw it over there in France, where there'd be over 100, anybody could come to these things, and there was people, everyone knew about it. So you really are dealing with the general public, but it's also what do you call it? It's not just people wandering into the cafe, but that could happen too. Like, somebody walks by and they hear you having a philosophical conversation, and they could say, I got you Socrates right here, some drunk guy or whatever. Like, have you ever had to deal with that sort of thing?
Yeah, you'd think it would happen a lot. And it's kind of a theme that I had marked out for the book, and I asked many authors to bring it up. But in fact, it never happened in the whole 12 years. There were a couple individuals who could have caused such problems, but it was dealt with in a way that it was not really a problem. And I did have to ask one person to stop coming. He was a regular, and he had really become quite kind of dysfunctional in some way. But but other than that, it didn't really happen. And then I went to India for 3 months, and I was just going to fold up shop in 2001. But the regulars said, no, we're going to run it. So they ran it for a period of time. And they had some problems of that sort. And they had a whole bunch of people showed up to protest. I think the topic was on marijuana. And all these marijuana activists showed up to protest. This is before it was legal here, and they showed up to protest before they realized that they weren't really complaining about it. They were just talking about it.
It was the pros and cons of marijuana. Yeah.
So they were invited in. I think I wasn't there, but I understand they were invited in and part of the discussion. But yeah, so that it never really was a problem. But in a broader sense, I mean, the problem was kind of similar. That is, people welcomed the chance to be there. They welcomed the opportunity to be heard. They loved being heard and came there to be heard in some sense. But they didn't necessarily know how to participate, right, or to how to do philosophy. So there were a couple of more, what should I say, effective, skillful participants who showed the way. And I took my facilitation role to be something like exemplifying that. although it was also exemplifying stand-up comedy for the most for the most part.
That's how
It's
I feel
called
in the
stand-up.
classroom.
Yeah,
That's
it's
how
been
I feel
called
in the classroom. I
right,
feel like
right.
I'm more of a stand-up comic than a stand-up philosopher.
Well, one person around here who was involved as an early facilitator called it stand-up philosophy, the cafe philosophy, because there is certainly an entertainment value to it. But the real question is, for me, became how do you draw in the great traditions and the ideas of the past without becoming pedantic. And I was surprised at how relevant it was, but there was some skill to bringing it up because someone would say something and I'd say, "Wow, Kant said that," and then they'd feel like, "Oh, great! I mean, Kant already came up with this. You can't compete with these people, right?" But I was just amazed that someone would come up with something that was actually, family resemblance to a Kantian idea or something else like that. So the whole that's where the essays evolved, where I would write about it to sort of pre-amplify or pre-resonate some of the themes that people could vibe on. Um, that's the How to Play philosophy, this book here. Um, but and but those even those essays, they never became the focus like a seminar, like let's discuss what I wrote. Um,
They were
but
guidance for the participants.
yeah, uh, a few people made use of them. Their real purpose was to steal. People would pick the low hanging fruit, right? People would say the obvious thing, so they would resort to cliches. Beauty is only skin deep. They'd say that's like
Love is a
the
four-letter word.
stuff like that. So I would write these essays partly to steal those and to subvert them, to invert them, to take them sort of off the playing field, so people would have to reach a little bit further for that, or at least would know how to deal with the low hanging fruit rather than just repeat them to, well, abuse them. Although no fruit was actually harmed in my essay writing.
Any advice for anybody who wants to start facilitating one of these? This is a labor of love. I mean, it's generally most of the people I read about in your book never charged anyone or asked for a what is that, an entrance fee or whatever you call it. So it's mostly a labor of love, even if they did accept, ticket money to come into the discussion or whatever. I mean, this is a major commitment to run. You did it on a weekly basis for years.
Yeah, right. Yes, well, there are different models, and there's quite a few do charge something or other. Um,
Admission fee, yeah.
I did charge from the start, and I wasn't going to at the beginning. It seemed somehow improper, coming fresh out of graduate school to pure discipline somehow. But the people at the cafe said, if you don't charge, people are going to think it's not worth anything, and you can't like not charge and then later charge. So I started with a $3 charge, and students got free, but it was always kind of by the person at the door. Sometimes I had a volunteer, always had permission to sort of wave people in if they needed. And you're right, you can't really make a lot of money on it. I think in the best years, $4,000 or $5,000 Canadian, I might have taken in for the whole year, 50 sessions or something like that. Um,
Right.
and when you think about the essays that went in with it and the organization, the posters and all that stuff, it's pretty
Yeah, it's
paltry.
less than minimum wage.
Right. Um, but uh, but there are other models. For one thing, there are university-based forms of Philosopher's Cafe, where the university, as part of its community outreach, takes on most of the publicity costs, and they might take donations. So that was the SFU model. There's also different models in Mexico, quite a few different models. So they're university based or community or cultural organization uh, run them as so they might put up the place and some of the funds for promotion and that sort of thing. So there are different models, and it's a labor of love, but it's also a team sport. You need help, you need support, you need volunteers. I had so many volunteers over the years who just decided, I will take the money at the door, not like take the money
Yeah.
and run, but they will collect the money, and they were very trustworthy people. And others who did the website and managed the email list, so I could just write my essays. And and in that sense, like there's certainly a value in it, a cultural value in it, just the same way people involved in arts organizations and so on put in a lot of volunteer time.
Yeah.
uh,
It's a
uh,
public service.
it's a public service, and it can be allied to philosophical practice. It was. I certainly got more clients through there and through the notoriety, as it were, of cafe philosophy. It's a bit of a media magnet, but just at the beginning and when you change things, and if you're in the news, then you are, and in the you can get free publicity for events and that sort of thing, right? So it's useful to keep in mind. And media interviews might come because you're someone known in the community as a philosopher available for public practice. So I think there's a lot of values to doing it. And if I haven't done it so far, it's partly because I'm fully employed now, and I'm in a much larger city. So it's a different matter altogether to get a kind of following. So I have to kind of be prepared to for a couple year commitment, and I'm not quite ready there. Um,
Yeah. Well, you paid your dues, let's just say, already. If any philosophers feel some kind of moral obligation toward public service in the form of philosophical, work, you certainly, like I said, you paid your dues there. I don't think you have to feel like you owe anything to society at that point to keep doing that. Writing about it, that's a good contribution too. So, and the
but
Tug
now
of
I have
Logic
this
is,
app, you see, and
yeah,
now I have this
Tug of
app. And
Logic.
the app was conceived as a solution to this
Yeah.
public participatory problem. So I feel like I have a bit of an obligation. And I'm also, I guess I'm frankly, a little worried. Maybe it won't work as well as I planned. I'm a little bit surprised. Like, I use it in my classroom, but I ease students into, I mean, 18-year-old students. So I ease students into it to get to the point where they can put out one reason at a time, and it's well articulated. And
Yeah.
uh,
I thought when I read about it that ideally a small number of players in each game. Speak to that?
yes, now this is an interesting matter, and I don't really have any definitive answers for it, but the size of the group makes a difference. Like, as you mentioned, in cafe philosophy, regularly in the heyday, Mark Sauté would get over 100 people. I got once on a birthday 100 people, and it was
Wow.
quite a scene. But definitely the best ones were 25 and below.
The
Although,
cafes, the
yeah,
cafes. Yeah.
although I preferred that for income purposes at 40 or 50 was a little bit better. But
Right.
still, like, there's a similar kind of thing, and I'm hedging around the question about Tug of Logic because I don't really know what its limits are. It's been played with 100 students, uh,
Oh,
at
okay.
high school students, but
Is that
it
that
was
ethics bowl thing?
at the Ethics Bowl, but it was a kind of an earlier version, and it didn't quite have phone functionality. So I was having teams vote on their no, actually the voting you could do on phones, but the entry of reasons you needed a laptop for it. That's since been fixed. But uh, so and that's the thing. Like, one there is the main limit for the size of people has to do with really the instructions. If you do, like I was said earlier, and every player is encouraged to write their own reasons out, then you get if n is the number of players, n times 3 or something, so you can get a lot of reasons, and then to actually choose which one is strategically makes sense to use. There, it makes sense to have an assistant, a logic referee, have an assistant who actually processes those. So if you have an assistant, you can deal with a larger group. The other thing, you can deal with the larger group by instructions. So in my class, I assign at a given event a few students only to be coming up with the reasons, and they do that in advance according to the procedures of critical thinking class kind of thing. So they prepare their arguments in advance, and then they just play them there. But that's still a facilitated discussion, and they may have to change. They write reports about it. So that you can do that. If you limit the number of people who are putting reasons, then you reduce that problem of the flood that I talk about, this flood of reasons that come in, that an assistant might help. But other than that, like the actual voting, when people are voting on the wording, so that's kind of the general audience, there's no real limit on that. That could be 100 people without any.
That could be the whole class, and you only have 6 people playing, right? And the rest of the
Right.
class can all vote. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so it can be adapted to that. And on the game itself is played on a website that's called tugoflogic.com, but the all the instructions and the rules and tips and modes of play, like different kinds of games like we're talking about here, different instructions effectively, they can all be played on the same app. So those are all available online, player feedback, that kind of thing. So it's the game is free and available for anyone to use at this point. But if they were just to stumble across the app itself, it's not entirely intuitive how to. It is kind of, but you have to kind of click through and know what you're looking for. But the instructions, so the Philosophy Sports website is the one that has the rules, the instructions, introductory videos, and various things like that. With that, any instructor, say, can start, or any philosopher could start a cafe philosophy public event.
And that's, is that at the same website that I mentioned when I introduced you?
No, but there are interlinks between them. So the
Links there.
coaching website is the name that I've given just to keep the same theme.
Right.
That's the one I use for my consulting philosophical praxis business. But Philosophy Sports is the site that has the information and details for how to play Tug of Logic.
Okay. Is it philosophysports.com? What's the name of the
Yeah,
website?
philosophysports.com. Yeah,
Okay.
all
Cool.
one word or with a dash. Yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to plug before we open it up to Q&A? Because I promised people it would be half and half, and we're already cutting into the Q&A here. So if there's
Okay, sure.
anything you want to plug.
Just the one thing I'll mention. I appreciate your time, and I think the questions and the course of the discussion have kind of brought out the main thing and given a flavor of the book. One thing that I kind of discovered that I didn't along the way in editing Cafe Conversations that I didn't realize, it does come out in the introduction now, is the degree to which Marc Sauté was inspired by and moved by Gerd Achenbach, whose books I'm now translating into English, and and they never met, although they were apparently, yeah, that's it, yeah, they never met, although apparently they were scheduled to meet before Marc Sauté died suddenly. And nevertheless, I've also learned that it's not clear that from Achenbach's perspective of what philosophical praxis really is, whether cafe philosophy or anything like it counts as philosophy. He's got a certain very specific idea about that. So I portray cafe philosophy and allied practices as a modality of philosophical praxis. But whether it really constitutes that in Achenbach's eyes, even though it sort of takes its leave from him,
Yeah.
Gives credit to him. I'm not sure he wants the credit, but it's a controversy. It's an interesting issue about
A
how
number
to.
of the essays, let's just say, work through the question of whether or not, and the criticisms of cafe philosophy as to whether or not it really counts as philosophy. So, not just with respect to Gerd Achenbach's view of philosophical practice, but
Right,
yeah, that debate seems to have been hit on by a number of different authors in various different forms. It's a really
right.
good read. I really appreciate the work. It takes a lot of work to put together an anthology like that. So thank you for your great contribution. All right, so let's turn it over to the audience.
That'll be fun.
Yeah, any questions, comments
Oh, there's a comment in the chat here.
from Henri? Really enjoying the topic. Thanks. Could you speak a bit about your techniques for incorporating general public non-philosophers in the cafe, and do you use these in philosophical practice? Yeah, I was curious also. Not well, of course, any tips would be greatly appreciated. But the other thing was the relationship between philosophy cafe and philosophical counseling. And this is a Venn diagram with some overlap, I'm sure, but it might be a very narrow overlap. It depends. I'm curious if
Yeah,
I would
well,
embellish
one
Henry's
thing that
question.
I think one thing that is a point of connection between the two um, is and even between Achenbach and philosophical and cafe philosophy is the idea that philosophy has to spring out of the non-philosophical. It has to come out of concrete life somehow. We have to philosophize out of life. So to be able to speak to a regular person who doesn't have a philosophy background and to draw out the philosophical dimensions of it, that's a similar skill, whether it's at cafe philosophy or it's in a philosophical dimension. But to do that in a way um, that is not I mean, I was going to use the word education, but cafe philosophy, in a way, its purpose is educational in a way. So the essays I wrote try to backfill in. Oh, look, there's a lot of philosophical background to these topics we're having fun discussing. Whereas Achenbach has a way of taking movies and books like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and people's lives and uh, and drawing philosophy out without the references and the credits and stuff, but to philosophers, he'll speak about those references and say, "Here, this is what's going on. You see what's going on." But there's a skill involved in drawing the philosophical out of the non-philosophical in some sense, and this is not a skill that you get in graduate school. And it is a
Yeah.
skill, though, in the sense that it is can be developed. And it's also like hermeneutics in a sense. It's hermeneutics in a sense that like it can be applied to interpreting movies or films or that sort of thing. You draw. They also tell stories, and we give stories an account of our life. So I think it's philosophizing in relationship to story fundamentally rather than argument per se. Um, and you'll might remember Mark Batterby's article from the collection where he advocates the feather technique, the talking stick method. And he says he's a critical thinking teacher. He's a published logic teacher, but at his cafe philosophy, he passes this feather around, and and the person who has the feather has the floor, and what they do is they say their piece, right? Um, they tell their story very often, as in relationship to the theme. Um, so that's I think yeah. So and Achenbach sees philosophy as more allied to literature and uh, artistic and allied to arts in some way, rather than to logic or the sciences. So that's part of it.
What comes to mind when I think about this topic is Socrates. Maybe, well, some of his interlocutors were other philosophers, but maybe the majority of them were not. They were just people. And so Socrates is a kind of role model for philosophical practice, as far as I can see in that regard.
Yeah.
Philosophers talking to each other is like doctors and medical researchers talking to each other, but then curing the sick, etc. This is the working with the public. There's some kind of an analogy there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Anyone else? You don't have to raise a hand. Here you can just unmute and speak.
Hello?
Henry, is it?
Oh, it worked. I finally got it.
Is
I've
is
been
it?
working on this. Yeah, it's
Oh,
Henri.
you
It's
got your
Henri.
sound working.
Yay.
And look, I feel embarrassed to ask you this because I've been with you a few times, but I forgot. Is it Henri or Henry?
Uh, either is fine, but it's originally Henri. Henri.
Henri. Okay, Henri. The spelling suggests that
But
anyway.
both
Okay.
work. Both work.
So
Um,
Henri, yes, please go ahead.
yeah, Michael, could you tell us more there? Because I suspect, especially with a lot of people, and you mentioned facilitator. Did you also do additional facilitation training or mediation training? I suspect that it could get pretty heated in the cafe sometimes when there are differences of opinion. And how did you interact with people? How did you intervene as the facilitator when argument ensued?
Yes, now it's interesting you mentioned mediation. So first of all, I rare were the times that there was any sort of conflict erupted. Maybe it's just my memory at this point, but very few times did that arise where a difference of opinion uh, got heated or something. I think that's much more likely to happen in a academic philosophy setting. Uh, Actually,
Yeah.
just a little digression. I was at the World Congress of Philosophy in Italy this summer, and I presented Tug of Logic and other things. But I left my mouse in a room, so I had to go back and get the mouse. And there was a session going on of these Chinese philosophers, and there was only a handful, 6 of them or something. So I sat there politely while this Chinese philosophy was going on. The guy finished his talk, and they sat at each other like you wouldn't believe. They seemed to know each other. They seemed to be friends, and they were very respectful, but it just seemed like they were just like, "What are you, a total fool?" I have no idea what they were really saying, but it was like the vociferous of the debate, the vociferousness of the debate is something that we're kind of cultured into in philosophy. Whereas in the cafe setting, I mean, at least in a Canadian cafe setting, things are kind of laid back and nobody wants to disagree too much. And even if they do disagree, they disagree by saying, like like with a facial expression looking at their neighbor or something like that. So it was actually a problem to get people to disagree a little bit more, like to take a stand on an issue. For fear of being proven wrong, for lack of certainty about what to say, or and people would come up with all kinds of things. I saw on television just the other day, and then they would relate some relevant story, but it wasn't germane to the key controversies, and it didn't even if it represented taking a side on the controversy, the person speaking was not taking a side by relating that story. So it's actually hard. Getting people to take a stand is like pulling teeth in a public setting in some ways. It's not that easy. Um, People are more offended by their social manners of each other and that sort of thing. But so there, I think the chief recipe and remedy, I guess I should say here to that, is comedy. Is jokes, but you have to do that in a way at nobody's expense. So you have to do it in a way that means it's okay for you to be bringing up this issue, but it's kind of funny anyway. um, so and that leaves everybody still willing to speak, and the person who just spoke not humiliated. Um, but these are like things come up in a cafe philosophy setting. But in the Tug of Logic setting, it hasn't really come up. I guess I can't really say, but still the interventions of the facilitator are different because they're about, okay, you're saying this is true. You're saying this is established or this is contested. Why? Why are you doing that? So it's all about the truth of the claim that's on the table at that time. It's much more clearly, at least possibly philosophical than the other method. So the problem in many ways is to stoke controversy, to realize that there's controversy. So to say, oh yeah, like what you're saying, I understand what you're saying. It's a little bit like the Kantian position, but there's this other utilitarian position which is completely opposite to that. And so you represent a plurality of perspectives. When people put out one perspective, you endorse that as one idea, and then you say, look at these other things. So that was my big role as a facilitator, is to say, oh, great, but look, options. And how to play philosophy too is kind of like it refuses to take a side, come down on things. It just except in attitude, right? Socrates did the same thing. I don't know, he would say, I don't have any wisdom, right? But when it came to things like whether it was better to live in ignominy or die, he had no doubt whatsoever. Whether it's better to suffer injustice or to commit it, he has no doubt whatsoever about that. So, like, there's a bit of a pretense to. So similarly with the facilitator at Cafe Philosophy, some things that are controversial, you have to make them more controversial, and other things you back away from just to keep the conversation going. So, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the general skills that you need to even teach an intro philosophy class. If you want your students to participate a lot, you don't want to create this kind of environment where people are afraid to speak and all this sort of thing. Yeah, you want to encourage them to debate, but not to debate so harshly that it's what John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist, philosopher, and friend of mine, makes this contrast. He's moving, he wants us to move into the courtyard of dialogue and out of the courtroom of debate. But of course, philosophers like the courtroom of debate. But when it comes to the general public, in the cafe, I think you want to have more like a courtyard of dialogue, right? Salon atmosphere, all that sort of thing. But so I think you did. I think you kind of implied that in answer to Henri that you didn't get any training in mediation and you don't need it. I think like philosophy professors, just having to teach philosophy to undergraduates is the training in being able to kind of facilitate cafes in general, although not all philosophy professors cultivate the skill that I think would make them feel comfortable in that environment. But
actually,
I remember...
actually, on that, because that's not quite accurate. It's true that I left that impression, but there was a side to the question I wanted to come back to. I did have mediation training. There's a wonderful organization in British Columbia. It's a parallel to one that was started in Saskatchewan. It's called the Justice Institute of British Columbia. They train police and firefighters for dealing with conflict. They train lawyers in mediation and conflict resolution and union people in negotiation and all sorts of stuff. And they have wonderful courses. They 1, 2, 3 week intensives where you mostly role play. And when I first went to and when I first went to them, they had a big influence on how I did cafe philosophy. Um, One of the things I learned there was in a negotiation or a mediation course, I can't remember, is one of the facilitators there said, everybody's position makes sense. And I was just struck, this is like Socrates, the Socratic paradox, like no one does evil intentionally. Every position makes sense. And just so I found it very philosophical in that sense. And it moved me from debate to dialogue. That's the way I put it. And it really transformed the way I facilitated, the way I invited people in. It increased women's attendance at the event after I started doing that. So it wasn't really very much of conscious application of theories and stuff like that, but it was it did have a big influence on me, and I have great esteem for that whole subject matter, especially when you move in the direction of a kind of a peace-loving mediation and negotiation and stuff like that. I find there's great depth to that.
Yeah, that's great. I thought also that I remember reading, I think it was you, but I'm not sure. There's a lot, a lot of stuff in that book. Was it you who said something like that somebody in the book referred to some kind of model of dialogue or communication? I forget what it was. There was some kind of theoretical framework that somebody in the book was using as a guide for how they managed to moderate, facilitate.
Yeah, I'm not sure because there's a few models of dialogue that are discussed. Like Lydia
Okay,
Mayer
so it's more than one.
covered in, a bunch of them, but she's not really a cafe facilitator. And there's the thing we mentioned about the talking stick method,
Yeah.
which is along the lines you're saying. Uh, but uh, yeah.
Well, it wasn't you then. No,
Yeah,
no.
it might have been because when I do the history of the cafe philosophy in
Oh,
Victoria,
you probably talked about it. Yeah,
I
you
talked
talked about
about that transition where the Justice Institute courses made a big difference in how I proceeded with things. Yeah.
it. Great.
Um,
Anybody
yeah.
else? Henri, did you have a follow up or was that good enough for you?
Not really a follow-up. I agree. I mean, I know that as an academic in California, I'm a physician. I'm not a philosopher, although I'm a medical ethicist. But I've become a mediator for Orange County and did some work with the courts. And I just found the whole process, the role-playing experience, extraordinarily helpful, and also helped me quite much in the classroom later and at work with colleagues. And so I was just really curious, Michael, that it sounds like you've done a lot of that as well, and it's really helped reinforced a lot of your teaching knowledge already.
Well, I wish I could say I've done a lot of it. I want to do a lot more. I will say that. I'm reminded of a couple of things that uh, I have done and more that I have ambitions towards, and that is the idea of philosophy sports is more general than the tug of logic. So that's why I came up with the two ideas. The idea of philosophy sports, I have ambitions to develop other kind of philosophy games, and chief amongst those is a role-playing game, role-playing games. I have used other kind of role-playing games in political philosophy course, like for Thomas Hobbes or John Locke. There's a few out there on in the literature that I think are just great, and I want to come up with something. Uh, but yeah, it's an ambition. I think the reason why I'm so motivated is really does come from those Justice Institute courses. I remember the first time or early time that I went and thinking, oh, role play. I don't want to do stupid role play. And then they made me, I was in this role play where I had to ask my pretend boss for a raise, which is a situation I would almost never find myself in since I'm in a union job and stuff like that. And my hands were sweating. And I realized, holy smokes, this is really powerful method. I've got all the nerves of that situation, and I'm stumbling with my words here, trying to ask my imagined boss this thing. This is powerful. We need a philosophy game involved in this sort of thing. So and I'm very interested in your role and your experience with role play. The one thing I did do once, it's coming back to me now. It's been many years. Uh, this was a deliberate. This is totally philosophy sports, but before I came up with the concept. There is something called the theater of the absurd. Uh, the Brazilian um, theatrics and dramaturgy that involve non-professional actors and involves people, public events, and people from the audience are called up to do these role plays essentially in scenarios that are oppressing them in their lives. And so theory of the oppressed is what I should have said. I said the wrong thing. Theory of the absurd is the French existentialist thing. I used the wrong term there. Sorry. For theater of the oppressed. Auguste Bois. Um, and I did that once. I had a contract to work with some healthcare workers, a highly unionized environment where there's government decisions are made that affect how they do their jobs, and they called those government people their overlords, which was really kind of remarkable. And I did these role play about what it was like trying to actually care for people who needed help. When you've got administrators checking how many staples you've used or something like that. So that it brought out the absurdity of their situation. That's why I kept thinking of absurdity of their situation in a way that allowed them to deal with it in a certain way, and certainly introduced me to it in a way that I didn't know anything about it. So I should be boldened by my past experience and do that more often. I would like very much to do that. If anyone wants to be a partner, call me.
Yeah.
Okay.
The master's program in philosophical counseling in Timisoara, Romania, some of the faculty there, I think they all also have a program in mediation, or they were trained in mediation. Alexander, it's good to see you again. Am I speaking correctly? Do you know about what I'm talking about? Because I met you in Romania. No.
Mm, Actually, I don't know because I'm from Serbia, not in Suarez, so I don't know
No, I
how
know. I
they
mean, we
use.
met there,
Yes,
though. I thought
yes,
maybe you
but I
might
don't know in
remember.
detail. I heard first time for the university then, so I don't know in detail how they
Okay.
work.
Yeah, no, I think I forget the name of the two faculty members there. I think first they got a program approved for mediation, and then it was easier for them to get the program in philosophical counseling because they're similar. So that's just something I wanted to mention. But another thing about role playing and sweating, um, Michael, years ago I took Gestalt psychotherapy as a client, and then I fell in love with it, and I joined the school, and I was training to become a
I've
Gestalt
read about
psychotherapist.
this with you. Yeah, I've read some, you've written about this. You've written about the
Yeah,
history. So I read this somehow.
yeah.
Yes. Go
But the
ahead.
one thing I want to mention is I remember one of the things that they play around with, one of their little techniques in Gestalt. It's not maybe not only Gestalt, but I know it's a big one among Gestalt psychotherapists is chair work. Where
Right.
say you're going through a problem with your spouse or your mother or whatever it is, and you don't know how to deal with them, and the psychologist says, "Okay," pulls up a chair, visualize them sitting in the chair, and then speak to them. Tell them what you are afraid to actually tell them in real life. And it's hard to actually do it. And then they say, okay, now go over and sit in the chair and be them and answer back to what you just heard. And you go back and forth and back, and it's really powerful.
That's
It's really
fabulous.
powerful. And I remember my therapist telling me, Rick, because at the time I was having real difficulty going through a divorce, was my wife in the chair, right? And he said, if you can conquer the version of your wife in your head, the outer wife won't be a problem. I couldn't even speak to the imaginary one the way I wanted to. I would get the same thing you got. Like, I was all anticipating how she'd react. It was very powerful, this kind of work. And he was right. Once I managed to do it in my mind, it was easier to deal with the outer world. Something stoic philosophy about that. I don't know. Maybe you can control things outside of you better if you can control things inside of you.
Yeah, actually, in this book on the essay on passion, I talk about Antonio Damasio's theory of the different kinds of sensations on the body, and I point out that there's a similar role to them in early Buddhist thought, the skandhas. That basically what happens is we evaluate situations, all sort of forebrain stuff. Is this good for me? Is this bad for me? Like we do in dreams, but in everyday life, we're doing this all the time. Is this good for me? Is this bad for me? And then when we figure if it's good for me or bad for me, there are sensations that happen along the body that are either positive or negative. And it's those that we are reacting to rather than the people out there. So if you can actually get to the point of reacting to your responding to your sensations, not in the habitual way, but just observation. That's the Zazen, just looking. Then you have this kind of self-mastery that is what Stoics were talking about for sure. And yeah.
Yeah, that recalls one of my books, anthology. What was it? Buddhist Perspectives on Free Will. There was an author in there, Emily McCrae, who wrote about this Buddhist sage, philosopher, and yogi named Tsongkhapa, all about emotional self-regulation. So that, yeah, this deep dive into the Buddhist philosophy of self-control through the emotions. Often we don't think we can control emotions. They just kind of happen. Well, they do, but yes, it's an interesting kind of feedback loop. There's a recursive, feedback loop between our cognition and our affect, and it can work in ways that we don't normally expect. But yeah, really interesting work there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we say we can't affect it, but then if we sit and talk about, think privately about, our biggest enemy for a while, we can work up a real lather. And also, if we like just privately think about sexual things we're interested in, we can work up a rather different lather. So the thoughts and the emotions are really well connected, but we choose
Yeah,
not.
there's a lot more room for it's at least proximal self-control. The forces working on us are not so proximal, but when they get into this close range here, we have a little bit more agency than we think we do. And when we pay attention to how we tick, we figure out where some of these controls are, right? Well, that's what I believe anyway.
For sure. Yeah, it's a skill too. It's rather than just figuring it out. I think there's
Yeah.
a mastery involved kind of thing.
Yeah, well, that's the
That's what meditation and stuff is about.
yeah,
Right?
there's a deep element of this virtue epistemology stuff that's in the whole Buddhist path, which is about practice, cultivating these skills by a kind of metacognitive analysis of yourself. And, this is Aristotle anyway. How do you cultivate anything? By doing it over and over again, right? So, all right. Well, any plugs for your future work, or we have to have you back because you've got a couple of books that we'll have you back.
Sure. Yeah. Like it would be good to do something about Gerard's book because that just came out. It's pretty fresh. But yeah, the plan was for this cafe conversation to be out already, but it'll be out soon.
Yeah, I was thinking about getting Gert Achenbach on the show here, but he doesn't speak English, right? We need a translator for him. I don't know
Yes.
if you'd have you and him on at the same time, or someone else who's a better translator. I mean, you translate written stuff. I don't know if you're good at capturing the verbal German.
You're right. It's a bit of an issue. They sprung it on me in Rome because Achenbach was drawn to Rome for the World Congress of Philosophy, and there was quite a big session actually on the book. And he prepared a very nice 11 theses, like Feuerbach theses, theses on Feuerbach, 11 theses on philosophical praxis. And I was handed them moments before and a rough English translation. And and then they went through them, and I was expected to translate on the fly. And then there were questions from the crowd, and it was really quite difficult. So it's not my skill area, but with a team, it can be done. And working with his person he works with there is a great. It could be done. It could conceivably.
All right, so maybe we'll have you and him and his translator. That's all. All right. Any last minute thoughts from you? I always like to give our guests the last word.
Okay, well, I would, I guess, especially just like to thank you for your interest and for taking the time, and for everyone who's here or listening in, and to invite people to use the Tug of Logic if they have an application for it, and yeah, I look forward to our next opportunity to talk.
Yeah, actually, the next one, let me announce it, October 20. It's Massimo Pigliucci, the Stoic, among other things. But his book that we're going to discuss is How to Be a Stoic, I think. Yeah. He's got a number of books on Stoicism, but that's the one that he wants to talk about. All right. Well, thank you for coming, Michael. Thank you, everyone else, for coming. Great conversation.
Yeah. Bye now.
All right, folks. Take care.
Goodbye.
Ciao.